Between 1847 and 1874, 97 souls vanished from a hidden settlement deep in the mountains of West Virginia. They did not disappear all at once, but in a rhythm so precise that it seemed less like chance and more like ritual. Every disappearance came exactly 3 months apart, always on the night of the new moon. And every time the same relic remained, a single leather shoe, the left one, resting in the middle of the missing person's bed. Inside was damp mountain clay mixed with pine needles, still warm, as if scooped from the earth's core moments earlier. When federal investigators finally reached Hollow Ridge in the winter of 1874, they found 312 residents thriving in a prosperity that defied geography and reason. In a valley unreachable by ordinary roads, the people dined on imported delicacies, wore silks and suits from Boston, and counted their fortunes in ledgers filled with impossible wealth. Yet not one among them would speak of the vanished. When asked, they gave only one answer, identical in tone and timing, like a chorus trained by something unseen. The mountain keeps its own accounts. What the investigators uncovered beneath that mountain, sealed within a forgotten copper mine, would vanish into government archives for more than a century. Even today, the full report remains redacted, its most disturbing pages blacked out by trembling hands. But the story of Hollow Ridge did not begin with disappearance. It began with desperation. The valley that would become Hollow Ridge lay buried between jagged walls of stone, so deep that sunlight reached it for barely 4 hours, even in high summer. Clouds clung to the mountaintops, pouring into the hollow like milk spilling into a bowl, smothering the land in pale mist. The settlers who came there in 1845 were not drifters or criminals. They were miners, engineers, and craftsmen. 43 families fleeing the collapse of Pennsylvania's coal empire, searching for a new beginning when industry and banks had stripped them of everything but their tools. Their leader, Josiah Henley, was a miner of uncanny instinct, a man who claimed he could smell copper in the rock long before his pick struck it. At 53, his back was straight, his eyes bright, and his voice carried the kind of conviction that could make even ruin sound like destiny. He had lost his wife to cholera years earlier and raised 3 sons underground, their childhood spent in the breathing dark of mine shafts. When the old world failed him, he promised his people a new one, a self-sufficient settlement far from the greed of corporations and creditors, where labor would serve only those who toiled. Henley's followers were handpicked, the Cranstons, experts in explosives, the Dietrichs, recent immigrants who knew the chemistry of ore refinement, the McGreedys, Scottish engineers who could force air through a mile of mountain, and the Sutterfields, whose patriarch was a Methodist minister eager to build a godly city untouched by sin. Each family was chosen for a skill, each for a purpose, gathered through whispered meetings in Pittsburgh boarding houses and candle-lit basements. Henley told them of surveys he'd made, samples he'd tested, veins of copper richer than any found in North America. But he promised more than wealth. He promised freedom. He had heard of the valley from a Cherokee guide named Joseph Stonecrow, met one winter night in a Wheeling tavern. The old man spoke of a place his people shunned, a valley where the rivers ran red after rain and where the ground itself seemed to breathe. The Cherokee called it the place where the earth bleeds. Their stories warned that the land was sick, that light sometimes moved beneath the soil on moonless nights, that the wind carried whispers that weren't its own. But where Stonecrow saw danger, Henley saw opportunity. By his tests, the valley's copper was impossibly pure, its veins deeper than any in the Appalachians. Geological logic said such formations couldn't exist here, yet his instruments didn't lie. He told no one beyond his trusted circle. If word spread, the mining companies would claim it before the first shovel touched soil. The journey into the mountains took 3 weeks through terrain that fought every mile. Wagons split their axles, horses drowned in swollen rivers, and one family turned back after losing a child to the current. Those who pressed on reached a valley so isolated it felt carved from another world. The forest ceiling swallowed the sun. The silence pressed against the ears until even breathing seemed loud. By the fall of 1846, Hollow Ridge had become a functioning settlement of nearly 200. They built homes from cedar and shale, a sawmill beside, Burden Creek, whose spring waters ran rust-red with minerals, and a modest church that stood as the only structure tall enough to catch morning light. Henley's leadership kept the community united. Reverend Paul Sutterfield filled his sermons with words of perseverance and providence, declaring that God had led them to a promised land. The settlers believed it, at least at first, but visitors noticed peculiarities. Hollow Ridge's copper was of unmatched purity, 99.9%, a perfection that defied metallurgy. Yet no one outside the settlement ever saw the smelting process. The miners worked only at night, slipping into the mountains through hidden entrances before dawn's first light. They returned clean, clothes unmarked by dust, hands free of grime. When questioned, they smiled too evenly and changed the subject. Telegraph companies paid triple for their copper wire, swearing it carried current with almost no resistance. Jewelers adored it. Their customers claimed it never tarnished, always warm against the skin as though alive. One Harvard scientist, Edmund Whitlock, came to study the phenomenon in 1847. His notes vanished. He resigned from his post the next year and never spoke of Hollow Ridge again. That spring brought the first disappearance. March 15th, the night of a new moon and the spring equinox. 19-year-old Margaret Dietrich vanished from her bed without sound or struggle. Her parents found the sheet smooth, her window open to the frost. In the exact center of her pillow, the journal told of an ancient mining people who had vanished long before the Cherokee came to those mountains. They had found the same copper veins, and in their greed or reverence had struck a bargain with the mountain itself. Their story ended not in extinction, but in transformation. Flesh turned to metal, blood to ore. They became part of what they had mined, absorbed into the living copper that pulsed in the earth like veins beneath skin. Cherokee oral tales, preserved by missionaries decades later, described that valley as forbidden ground. They called it the breathing place, a wound in the world where the earth exhaled poison and inhaled life. Every year, medicine men performed rituals to keep it sealed. They offered goods, prayers, and sometimes lives to ensure the hunger below remained buried. The beings who once worked those tunnels, the story said, were not men and not spirits. They came before memory, before the first sunrise, and their tunnels twisted through dimensions that defied reason. Inside them, up became down, narrow became infinite. Those ancient miners sought something they should never have found. What they unearthed consumed them, leaving behind the copper that bled like flesh and sang like breath. Centuries later, Spanish explorers had glimpsed the same curse. In 1561, Rodrigo de Guzman recorded finding vertical shafts 3 feet wide, too smooth and perfect for primitive tools, plunging hundreds of feet into blackness. At the bottom, he found chambers of molten geometry and copper figures so lifelike his men mistook them for corpses. When they struck one statue with a hammer, it disintegrated into dust, and the soldier who swung the blow died within hours, his sweat metallic and red. The local guides refused to approach the site, calling it the home of the Starwalkers, beings who had descended from the sky to drink the blood of the earth. They warned that those who touched the copper would become one with it. They would never die, but would never live again. When Henley's people entered Hollow Ridge in 1845, they found those same shafts sealed with stone. Some had collapsed. Others still breathed faint drafts of air that smelled like thunder. Inside the deepest tunnels, Henley discovered walls lined with veins of copper so pure it gleamed like liquid. He and his men worked by lamplight, climbing down a vertical shaft 400 feet deep, using ancient iron brackets fused half into the rock. Many of those brackets had turned to copper, transformed by forces that shouldn't exist. And when Henley touched the walls, he felt a vibration, not heat or electricity, but something that traveled through bone and marrow. In that instant, he saw flashes of places that defied comprehension. Shapes that existed beyond the limits of the visible world. Friedrich Dietrich, the settlement's chemist, began experiments with samples taken from those walls. In a hidden cellar laboratory, He melted, cut, and tested the copper's behavior. His secret notes, later found decades after the town's fall, described properties that bordered on the supernatural. The copper maintained a constant temperature, 98.6 degrees, human warmth. It refused to cool or heat. When submerged in water, it made the liquid pulse like a heartbeat 20 times per minute, small whirlpools spinning in alternating directions. Multiple pieces placed together synchronized, creating rhythms too complex to be chance. Watching it for long induced nausea and dreams of breathing earth and whispering stone. Dietrich wrote that he had seen the metal move when left alone, its edges growing imperceptibly the way roots creep through soil. By 1850, Hollow Ridge had grown rich beyond imagination. Copper flowed from the earth as if mined by invisible hands. Mansions rose from timber, children studied from imported books, and families dined on china from London. Running water, heated by self-warming copper pipes, ran through every home. At night, gas lamps burned blue-green without consuming fuel. Visitors came and left quickly, unsettled by the unnatural perfection of everything. But prosperity carried its cost. Every 3 months, another disappearance. Each one precise, never early, never late, always the new moon. Always the single shoe. Federal surveyor Cornelius Vance arrived in 1851 to document mineral rights. His official report described a prosperous community, efficient and orderly. His private journal, found decades later, painted a nightmare beneath the calm. He stayed with the Cranstons, whose dinner table was always set for 7, though only 4 family members ever appeared. The unused plates bore crumbs and stains when cleared away. When he asked about them, Mrs. Cranston replied with a distant smile, "They're working below." At night, Vance heard humming that seemed to rise from the bedrock. It vibrated through the floorboards, faint yet constant, like the earth whispering beneath his skull. Restless, he followed a group of miners one midnight, slipping through the mist into the forest. They walked in perfect unison without lanterns, their movements eerily synchronized, eyes fixed on something unseen. They reached a clearing and descended into the old working through a hidden hatch disguised as a tool shed. 30 men entered, each carrying a small leather pouch around his neck. Their bodies hummed, not audibly, but visibly trembling in rhythm with one another. When dawn broke, only 28 men returned. Their pouches bulged, and their skin shimmered faintly with copper dust. The missing 2 were never mentioned again. Vance confronted Henley later that day, but the foreman merely smiled. 2 from 30, he told him. A fair tax. The government takes more and gives less. Vance fled that afternoon, his journal recording the words that would later haunt the investigation. The copper they mine is real, but its cost is measured in flesh. The pattern continued for decades. Every season claimed another. The clay inside each shoe grew stranger, sometimes containing fragments of minerals unknown to science, sometimes tiny metallic spheres that rolled toward the mine as if drawn by That night, Hartley found what sealed his madness. Beneath the church, buried under its cornerstone, lay the compact. Written on treated human skin that shimmered green with copper salts, it outlined the settlement's true covenant. In exchange for unending prosperity, they would feed the mountain on the new moon. The selection would be random, the offering willing. Should anyone refuse, the mountain would rise and consume them all. At the bottom of the page was an addition in Henley's unmistakable hand. We accept our role as shepherds of the feeding. May God forgive us for what we have become. The compact was not merely a document. It was a declaration that Hollow Ridge had stepped beyond the realm of men. Every founding family had signed it in blood, each name darkened by age, but still damp to the touch, still carrying the metallic scent of iron and copper. They had entered into a living agreement with the earth itself, and from that moment on, the mountain owned them. Henley's amendment revealed a chilling acceptance of their fate. They would serve as shepherds of the feeding, offering themselves and their descendants as caretakers of the hunger beneath. The copper would enrich them, but their wealth was never free. They believed that as long as they paid their debt in flesh, the mountain would remain satisfied. Attempts to break the covenant came swiftly and ended in horror. In 1853, the Washburn family tried to flee during a storm, their wagon loaded with children and supplies. At dawn, they were found at the edge of the valley, transformed into statues of pure copper, expressions of terror frozen on their faces. The settlers melted them down and forged jewelry from the metal, wearing it as a reminder of the price of betrayal. 6 years later, a group of younger men led by Robert Cranston, the same who had once loved Margaret Dietrich, tried to seal the mine with explosives. The blast shook the valley but left the entrance untouched. By morning their hair had turned white, their bodies frail and withered as if decades had passed overnight. They lived only long enough to whisper that the mine was a mouth and that it had teeth. By 1874, the pattern had run its course. 27 years since the first disappearance. 96 souls fed to the depths. The number itself, 3 times 3 times 3, appeared in every symbol carved into the copper walls. The Cherokee had called it the number of completion, the mark of an ending. The people of Hollow Ridge knew what was coming. The final offering was due. The lottery named Mary Henley, Josiah's granddaughter. 16 years old, beloved by all, the only spark of innocence left in that tainted valley. For the first time, someone defied the ritual. Mary refused to go. She barricaded herself. The government classified the event immediately. The valley was declared unsafe, sealed under claims of mercury and copper poisoning. The official report spoke of hallucinations and geological instability. The rest vanished into locked archives. The story of Hollow Ridge ended where it had begun, in silence. The official record said Hollow Ridge fell to a mine collapse, that chemical poisoning had driven its citizens to madness. But those who were there knew the truth. They saw the mountain breathe its last sigh before sealing itself shut. They saw the earth smooth over as if swallowing a secret it had grown tired of keeping. And though the investigators recorded nothing supernatural, they could not explain the heat that rose from the stone, or why the rock felt like skin to the touch. Mary Henley was the last of her bloodline to survive. Federal doctors examined her under orders from Washington, but her body defied every test. Her heartbeat slowed to half the human norm. Her skin was cool yet faintly pulsing, as though something within moved in harmony with a rhythm deeper than life. When questioned, she gave no answer except a single whispered phrase that made even the most hardened investigator flinch. They chose to hold the door closed. The 93 found wandering the woods became the government's problem. They were relocated to hospitals across the country under false names. Most were identified as long missing persons, some gone 30 years or more. None could remember where they had been, only dreams of suffocating in stone while hearing voices singing through the dark. Their skin bore faint metallic patterns fine as veins of ore. Within 5 years, nearly all were dead. Those who lived longer raved about tunnels of light and walls that breathed. Only fragments of what happened below remained. Samuel Hartley, the journalist who had descended into the mine, survived, but was shattered. He was committed to the Shepard Pratt Asylum in Baltimore. Time buried Hollow Ridge, but time never forgets. The land that once held its prosperity now lies fenced and silent, marked only by government signs that warn of unstable ground. Yet even now, deep instruments buried in the soil detect vibrations that rise and fall in measured rhythm, an endless breath drawn from the lungs of the earth. Every quarter, on the night of the new moon, that rhythm strengthens. It lasts for hours, like something waiting for an offering that will never come. The official story remains unchanged. The valley, they say, was poisoned by its own wealth, its residents driven mad by mercury and copper fumes. The mine collapse was an accident, the survivors delusional. But beneath the sanitized reports, fragments of the truth survived in letters, in whispers, in the journals hidden by those who could not forget. Samuel Hartley's final writings, discovered in the wall of his asylum cell, told the rest of the story. He wrote of what he saw after the 4 elders descended to their fate. They had not been consumed like the others. They had chosen their transformation. They became part of the copper not as victims but as sentinels. Their minds, bound into the metal, formed the locks that held the hunger in place. They would remain conscious for eternity, aware but unwavering, their will forming the last barrier between the world above and what waited below. Hartley described how Henley, Dietrich, McGreedy, and Sutterfield positioned themselves around the chamber, linking their bodies with the copper's living veins. The metal grew through them like roots taking hold. Their final act was not surrender, but defiance, a sealing both physical and spiritual. As the copper absorbed them, the mountain convulsed, sealing itself shut. The breathing slowed, then ceased. The old working was no longer a passage, but a tomb. When Hartley fled, he heard the last words echo through the tunnels, not spoken but felt. "We will hold the door. Pray that it never opens again." He lived only long enough to record those words, his mind fracturing under what he had witnessed. The drawings he left behind showed 4 human figures, their bodies branching into copper filaments that merged with the rock, spreading outward